Hello guys and welcome back. Today we continue with the Jagdtiger from Hobbyboss. Last time we focused on assembly and a few improvements, and now it's time to paint it. First, I will carefully clean the entire model with soapy water. Fingerprints, dust and other residues can impair adhesion or, in the worst case, even become embedded in the paint. I can speed up the drying process a little with a hairdryer. And then it goes straight into the paint booth. The base coat is a black acrylic primer from Vallejo's Mecha series. Compared to Vallejo's regular primers, the Mecha series is more resistant and has better adhesion, but a satin finish. To thin the primer more effectively for airbrushing, I mix it with their own flow improver. I have left the roof and the engine deck separate so far, in order to paint the interior and the ventilation grills black from the inside. Virtually nothing of the interior will remain visible, but better safe than sorry. Once the primer is completely dry, I can paint the base for the camouflage. For this I am using dark yellow, as I do with almost all my German vehicles. The initial version from AK Interactive is still the shade I like the best. The black primer has one disadvantage here. It's significantly more difficult to spray a light color over a dark one. Therefore, I always need a few more coats of paint for this step to achieve the desired coverage. However, it's also very easy to create shadows, since I simply need to apply the paint less opaquely in the darker areas. And here we have the Jagdtiger completely in dark yellow. Where the side skirts were previously attached, the Jagdtiger would not be dark yellow, but still in its oxide red primer. It would have been easier, of course, to paint the oxide red first, then cover it with masking tape before applying the dark yellow. But since I forgot to do that, we will have to make it a bit more complicated. I am now carefully spraying a thin stripe of oxide red along the lower edge. I'm trying to work as precisely as possible to avoid overspray as much as I can. And since I already had oxide red in my airbrush, I decided to paint the lower hull the same way. Especially towards the end of the war, time and resources were oft lacking, particularly to completely paint such huge tanks. Therefore, less important areas were sometimes simply left out. I also really liked the effect on my Jagdpanther. I can also distinguish the inside of the gun mantlet somewhat from the rest like that. And the edge is still soft, of course, which is why I now need to improve it a bit with masking tape. Fortunately, the dark yellow provides perfect coverage and is completely uniform again with one or two quick coats. Smaller areas, like this edge at the front where the fender is missing, are easier to paint with a brush. I'm also painting a few of the large tow hooks oxide red. These may have been replaced later and thus provide some additional color contrast. Similar to the inside of the gun mantle, I'm also painting the corresponding part on the tank in oxide red. I imagine that this would have been difficult to paint on the rear vehicle, and therefore it might have simply been omitted. However, I don't want to leave the Jagdtiger in just dark yellow. Such a large area is perfect for further improving my freehand airbrushing skills. For this, I'm using the new acrylic paints from Ammo by Mix Atom range. Normally, for such freehand patterns, lacquer-based paints are easier than acrylics. However, these acrylic paints promise the advantage of lacquers combined with the less toxic properties of acrylics. And while I can't compare them to actual lacquers, I can say that these paints are perfectly adequate for my needs. I diluted them heavily with 70 to 80% thinner and spray them at just under 1 bar of pressure. This allows me to get much closer to the model with the airbrush and achieve a finer and more controllable paint application. I don't replicate an exact camouflage pattern, but I try to roughly follow one of the color patterns included in the instructions in terms of color proportions. Since my paint is very diluted, as mentioned before, I need several coats to achieve the necessary coverage. It's crucial, however, that the previous coat is completely dry. Otherwise, I risk blowing the paint away and smearing it. This is probably one area where lacquer-based paints are significantly easier to handle, as they are usually more opaque. Next up is red-brown. Here too, I have opted for the classic 3-color camouflage. I will spray the brown spots between the green stripes. Since I'm spraying the pattern freehand, I don't have to deal with annoying masks and can create better and more precise transitions, especially at the edges. Here I'm primarily going by feel. The areas where it still feels like something is missing get a bit more red-brown. As before, several coats are necessary until the color is properly opaque. Next, I will continue with post-shading and color modulation. To do this, I will first mix a slightly lighter dark yellow tone. I now carefully spray this into the center of the dark yellow spots. This makes them less saturated and gives them a more aged and weathered look. Since the edges and corners remain darker, I achieve various subtle color gradients and the surface is now less uniform. This slight color adjustment has already had a significant effect on the appearance. And it has achieved the effect I was hoping for. I will now repeat the same process for the red-brown and the olive green. I will lighten the red-brown with a shade called Zimmerit and the dark green with Reseda green. I think this is where I would reach the limits of normal acrylic paints like AK's 3rd Gen or Vallejo's Air series. I now need to paint as precisely as possible within the areas of color while still leaving the edges as unaltered as possible. This is another step that looks completely wrong at first glance. My initial thought was that the color was way too light and didn't fit into the overall picture. But once again, it's important to trust the process. After drying, the color becomes less intense and blends seamlessly with the darker base tone. Initially, I wanted to leave the wheels entirely dark yellow. But then I felt the running gear would look unfinished, so I quickly sprayed a few wheels olive green and red-brown to add some visual interest to there as well. I had the same thought process for the gun barrel. A few rings in green and brown should help to better integrate it with the rest of the vehicle. Next up are the decals. There aren't many here, so just a few crosses and the vehicle number. After spraying on a coat of clear varnish for protection, I used Microsol and Microset for better adhesion. It shows the number 211. I couldn't find any reliable sources on the appearance of the real 211, as it appears in some pictures with Zimmerit and in others without. Therefore, I couldn't verify which of the two vehicles is the actual 211. However, less information also means my camouflage pattern might be less inaccurate. With a stiff brush I can carefully press the decal into the steel texture and conform it to the surface. I also added 2 Balkenkreuzes on the back, contrary to the instructions, simply to better fill the empty space. Next up is the chipping. I like to use a 2-stage chipping technique. For the first part, I need to mix a slightly lighter shade of dark yellow again. Then I take a small piece of sponge and dip it into the paint. I then dab almost all of the paint off on a piece of kitchen roll until only a few traces of paint remain on the sponge. I will test the paint application on one of the wheels first. This would be the easiest place to correct any mistakes. After that, I can carefully dab the sponge over all the corners and edges. This leaves very fine and irregular spots, which represent the first layer of chipping. Because protruding details are inevitably pressed deeper into the sponge, this method makes it very easy to highlight the details better and to depict a more natural wear and tear. But it's very important that almost no paint remains on the sponge. Otherwise, the chips will be too large and there will be too many of them, making the whole effect look more like a toy. Light green and light brown would probably be more suitable for green and brown areas. But I think that's not so important at this scale. And underneath the green and brown, there is also dark yellow on the rear vehicle, which is why it is still realistic to chip the entire vehicle with this color. On such a large vehicle, it would simply be too much work for me to first apply the light green and brown chipping, then the light yellow, and then the steel color. However, on a very small vehicle, it would certainly be very interesting to try out whether such an elaborate chipping would actually have a visible effect. The sponge allows you to work on large areas relatively quickly and creates a good base. But afterwards, I will still use a fine brush. This allows me to combine several small spots into larger chips. I can also better highlight the edges with the brush. To do this, I hold the brush at a shallow angle and carefully brush along the edges and corners. These areas are often the first where such wear and tear becomes visible. This step helps to bring out the details on contours better and creates more depth on the model. The oxide red has become slightly contaminated again in the meantime due to overspray and unwanted chipping. Therefore, I'm quickly applying another coat to unify it again. Then I mix some of the oxide red with my previous chipping color to obtain a lighter shade. Of course, chipping would also occur on the oxide red parts, but I can't make the chips in the light yellow here. However, this lighter shade of red is perfect for that. On the Jagdpanther, I also chipped the entire lower hull and running gear. I'm skipping that here though, since the effect wasn't visible after mud and dust anyway. Now let's move on to the second part of the chipping. These are the chips that are not just superficial scratches, but penetrate deep into the steel. Using a very fine brush, I now try to fill in as many of the light chips as possible. It's important that I leave the outer edge light though. This step looks quite complicated at first, but it's actually very relaxing. I've already drawn a kind of guide from the previous chips showing me where I need to work next. So I just have to fill in the gaps without worrying too much about the placement. Of course, I don't fill in every tiny chip. Not only would this be virtually impossible, but also unrealistic. Some damage wouldn't even be deep enough to show the steel underneath. I chose Panzer Grey for the color of these chips. In the past, I have also used reddish tones that look more like rusting steel. I think both colors are perfectly fine, and ultimately it comes down to personal preference and whether you want the vehicle to look newer or older. The larger chips might stand out a bit more now, but that's why I'm doing this step before the wash, so I can blend everything a bit better later. This step, I think, requires some practice, as I really only need to lightly dab the surface with the brush in some places. Too much pressure can quickly make the spots too large, which still happens to me often enough. It's also certainly helpful to have a few references nearby to get a feel for how the paint actually flakes off in real life. And finally, I will use the sponge again, this time with the dark grey tone. I still can't get my chips fine enough to have a better transition. That's why I'm now carefully going over a few areas with the sponge to touch them up. Next, I will paint the tow ropes and various tools. Since the cables are only glued to the vehicle at their mounting points, I can slide a piece of paper underneath to make painting easier. I chose this medium grey as the base color. It should be a good foundation for all the later effects, even if it doesn't look entirely realistic right now. The tools such as shovels, pliers and hammers are also primed in grey, although I later chose a darker shade for them. I also primed the periscope and angle mirrors in grey, as that is how they looked in real life too. Now I'm painting all the wooden parts, such as tool handles, the gun cleaning rods and the wooden block at the back of the vehicle with old wood from Vallejo. Later I will try to improve them with oil paints, but it's too early for that step now. On museum vehicles, the tow hooks are often painted in the vehicle's camouflage pattern for convenience. This wouldn't have made much sense on a real vehicle, so I'm repainting them in dark yellow. I've chosen AK's dark yellow variant 1944. This shade is significantly darker and greener than the other colors and therefore adds some more visual interest. I painted the handles of the wire cutters oxide red, since they were also red in real life. The Jagdtiger also has a few spare track links. After priming them black, I'm now giving them a coat of German grey. This will be my base for the subsequent metal and rust effects. Once this layer is dry, I mix a very thin light grey, almost like a wash. Then I roughly apply it to all the track links. Any pooling or blotches are not a problem here, but actually highly desirable. After the wash has dried, I now have very fine and faint residues and stains, which simulate discoloration and impurities of the steel surface. Later I will continue working with rust effects here. I deliberately left the exhaust pipes separate to make them easier to paint. I'm now priming the actual pipe with light grey. The intense heat from the exhaust gases would make these areas perfect for depicting heavy rust. Using rust brown paint and a small piece of sponge, I can now apply the first layer of rust, almost like heavy chipping. I will further refine these areas later with enamel products as well. Let's quickly take care of the tracks. After painstakingly assembling them in the first part, they now receive a coat of black primer. The black is very helpful here because it means I don't have to worry about completely painting every single spot later with the actual color. After the black, I apply a layer of my own mix. This consists of track primer, rust primer and a few drops of white to lighten everything up. I don't want the tracks to look too rusty, since the vehicle is in use and in motion. In the areas where the track regularly comes in contact with hard surfaces, it wouldn't rust but would remain shiny due to abrasion. I'm still testing how to create this effect most easily yet realistically. Here I rubbed a soft pencil over the surface. Let's see how much of it will still be visible in the end. For the wear on the inside of the tracks, I used acrylic paint. The wear on the road wheels, however, is very easy to achieve. Since the Jagdtiger has steel road wheels without rubber pads, I simply use one of AK's acrylic markers. This is truly one of the best applications for these markers. The paint has excellent coverage and I have almost no risk of accidentally painting the wrong areas, as could happen with a brush. Finally, I'm now protecting all the work done so far with a coat of satin clear varnish. And that completes the work for this episode. Such a large vehicle needs a lot of paint. With so much surface area, each step takes longer than on a smaller vehicle, but I think it was worth it. I think we now have laid a good foundation to fully focus on weathering and mud effects in the next episode. I'm certainly very curious to see how well all the details will come across once the wash is applied. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.